This is a post by Peter Todd titled Soft Fork Covenant Dependent Layer 2 Review, published September the 2nd, 2024. On-chain wallets achieve a roughly one-to-one mapping of transactions to transactions. For every economic transaction that a user performs, roughly one blockchain transaction is needed. Aggregations, coin join, cut-through payments, etc. change this statement a bit, but it's roughly correct. Lightning achieved a many-to-one mapping of transactions to transactions. The magic of Lightning is that an effectively infinite number of economic transactions can happen in a single Lightning channel, which itself is tied to a single unspent transaction output, or UTXO. Essentially, we've taken the time dimension, transactions, and achieved a significant scaling by collapsing that dimension. But creating even a single UTXO per user is arguably not good enough. So there are many proposals out there to achieve even greater scaling by allowing multiple users to share a single UTXO in a self-sovereign way. Again, collapsing another space dimension of scaling users into one UTXO. Our goal here is to do an overview of these proposals, figure out what technical patterns they share, figure out what kinds of new opcodes and other soft fork upgrades they need to function, and create a comparison table of how all the parts fit together. Along the way, we'll also define what an L2 protocol actually is, what kind of scaling Lightning is already capable of, and get an understanding of what improvements we need to do to mempools to achieve all this. Thanks goes to Folger Ventures for sponsoring this research. They had no editorial control over the contents of this post and did not review it prior to publication. Thanks also goes to Daniela Brazzoni, Sarah Cox, and others for pre-publication review. Definitions. What is a layer 2? Often the term layer 2 is defined broadly, to a point where even a bank-like entity, such as Liquid, could be defined as a layer 2. For the purposes of this article, we will adopt a strict definition. A layer 2, L2, is a Bitcoin-denominated system with the purpose of allowing Bitcoin to be transacted more often than the number of on-chain transactions with other parties, such that either no one is able to profitably steal funds in the system, taking into account in-system punishments and costs, out-of-system costs and punishments like reputation loss, legal consequences, etc., are not considered in our definition. Preferred. The true owners of the funds are able to unilaterally withdraw their funds, minus transaction fees, without the cooperation of any third parties. The first option is required because we want our L2 systems to be able to represent amounts and transactions of such small value that they are unable to be represented on-chain. For example, in Lightning, HTLCs can have a value too small to represent on-chain. In that circumstance, the HTLC value is added to the transaction fee of the commitment transaction. While a Lightning node can steal a dust HTLC by closing a channel at the right moment, doing so is more expensive than the HTLC is worth, making the theft unprofitable. That said, unilateral withdrawal is always our primary design goal. With this definition, things like Lightning are considered L2 systems. However, systems such as Liquid, Cashew, and Fedimint are not L2s, because another party or parties has control of your funds. Client-side validation schemes like RGP are also not L2s under this definition, because they are unable to trustlessly transact Bitcoin itself. Finally, state chains fail to make the cut, because the state chain entity can steal funds if they do not follow the protocol. What are covenants? And why do more scalable L2 systems need them? In Bitcoin scripting, covenants are mechanisms by which the way a TX out can be spent is restricted in advance, such that the form of transactions used to spend that TX out are predefined or otherwise restricted in a way that is not purely limited to signatures. L2 systems that share UTXOs between multiple parties need covenants because they need ways of constraining how the UTXO can be spent to implement the rules and incentives of the L2 protocol. Recursive covenants. A recursive covenant is a covenant with a property that the rules constraining how a UTXO can be spent can be applied recursively to a child UTXO of the spending transaction indefinitely. Recursive covenants have long been considered to be undesirable by some because they can encumber coins indefinitely, or at least indefinitely without the permission of a third party, such as a government. Goals. Lightning is the current best-in-class Layer 2 system out there. However, it has its limitations. Namely, scaling. Lightning currently requires at least one UTXO per end user. Liquidity. Lightning requires funds to be tied up in channels. Interactivity. Lightning requires the recipients of payments to be online in order to achieve them trustlessly. In evaluating Layer 2 systems, our goal will be to improve on these key limitations, ideally without adding new limitations. Lightning's scaling limits. What does one UTXO per end user mean in practice? Since Lightning channels can operate indefinitely, one way of looking at this is to ask how many new channels can be created per year. Creating a taproot output has a marginal cost of 43 virtual bytes if channel creation is amortized. With many channels created in a single transaction, the other transaction overhead can be made negligible, and fairly large numbers of channels can be opened per year to onboard new users. For example, suppose that 90% of block capacity went to opening new taproot Lightning channels. That would be 52,560 blocks per year, multiplied by 1 million virtual bytes per block, multiplied by 90% times 1 channel over 43 virtual bytes equals 1.1 billion channels per year. It's estimated that about half of the global population owns a smartphone, 4.3 billion people. So we can in fact onboard a significant percentage of the entire population that is likely to be able to make use of a Lightning channel per year. However, channels do not last forever. On occasion, users will want to switch wallets, increase or decrease channel capacity, etc. The most efficient method to change the capacity of a channel is via splicing, notably implemented in Phoenix Wallet. Like channel opens, splicing could also be done in an amortized fashion to improve efficiency, with multiple splice operations sharing a single transaction to reduce the number of inputs and outputs necessary to add and remove funds. Thus, the delta block space required per user splice, assuming the use of musig, is the 43 vbyte taproot output plus the 57.5 vbyte taproot keypath span, for a total of 100.5 virtual bytes. If we again assume a 90% block space usage, we get 52,560 blocks per year times 1 million virtual bytes a block times 90% times 1 splice over 100.5 virtual bytes equals 470 million splices per year. Finally, note how switching Lightning channels between wallets can be done in a single transaction by either trusting the next wallet to sign a commitment transaction after the funds have been sent to the commitment address, or with cooperative close to new channel support in both wallet implementations. Of course, there are competing use cases for Bitcoin beyond Lightning channels, and how that will translate into fee rates is difficult to know, but these numbers give us a rough ballpark that suggests that with current technology, it is at least technically possible to support hundreds of millions of self-sovereign Lightning users. L2 overview. Under our definition of L2 systems, there are two main design patterns being discussed in the Bitcoin development community. 1. Channels. 2. Virtual UTXOs. In the channel pattern, of which Lightning is the main example, the protocol progresses by exchanging pre-signed transactions between the parties that could be mined, but are not in the happy path, so to speak. These pre-signed transactions split a UTXO between the parties. Transactions happen by repeatedly changing the balance of that split with new pre-signed transactions. Since there will be many different possible valid transactions spending the same UTXO, some incentive mechanism is needed to make sure the correct transaction is the one actually mined. In the virtual UTXO, VUTXO design pattern, of which ARC is the most prominent example, VUTXOs are created via covenants or multi-party agreement, via the creation of transactions that could be mined to actually create the desired UTXO on-chain, but are not in the happy path, so to speak. In that respect, VUTXOs are similar to channels, but unlike channels, VUTXO schemes do transactions by spending the VUTXOs themselves in, conceptually, a single pre-signed transaction. The happy path design pattern is the use of an all parties agree script path, such as an n of n multisig. Taproot is designed specifically for this concept, allowing the key path to be an n of n multisig via musig. Assuming that all parties agree, the happy path allows for the coins to be efficiently and privately spent. Interestingly, since virtual UTXOs are real in many senses, it is quite easy to build channels on top of virtual UTXOs by simply creating virtual UTXOs that, if mined, would lead to the creation of the UTXOs required for the channels. In that sense, virtual UTXO schemes are slightly lower layer than channels. Lightning. The status quo, implemented in production as the Lightning Network, primarily based on the Bolt standards. Lightning is a combination of a number of things, including Lightning channels and HDLCs, the peer-to-peer routing network, onion routing, invoice standards, etc. Notably, Lightning is not a consensus system, so different elements of the Lightning system, so to speak, need to be adopted in the exact same way by all users. For the purpose of this article, when we say Lightning, we'll use it in the broad sense, including easily foreseen upgrades to the current typical Lightning protocols that are widely used. As discussed above, the key characteristic of Lightning is its end-user scalability limit, due to the need to have at least one UTXO per user. That said, for the core routing element of Lightning, the public Lightning nodes that route the vast majority of transactions, these scalability limits aren't much of a concern as Lightning functions just fine if there are far more end users than routing nodes, because each public channel used for payment routing can easily support a large number of transactions per second. This is also why so many future L2 systems are expecting to also participate in the Lightning Network. We also see this in how existing, not quite L2 systems, like Cashew, rely heavily on the Lightning Network to actually be useful. The primary usage of Cashew was probably to send and receive Lightning payments. Non-interactive channels. This construction improves on Lightning channels by using OpCTV to reduce the interactivity requirements. However, as it doesn't improve on the 1 UTXO per user scaling limit, we won't discuss it further. Channel factories. Here we have multiple parties negotiate a single n-of-n multisig address, along with a transaction spending that multisig address to create n different UTXOs, splitting up the funds. These UTXOs, in turn, are used for payment channels. These channels can be used with the same security as if they had been directly opened on-chain, because in the event that the channel state needs to be put on-chain, the split transaction can be mined. This potentially saves on-chain space when the channels are closed, as the n parties can, in theory, cooperatively close all n channels at once. Since channel factories are negotiating UTXOs that could be mined, but are not expected to actually be mined in the happy path, they're a very primitive example of virtual UTXOs. Channel factories by themselves do not require any soft forks to be possible. However, the simple channel factories described above are probably impractical beyond small numbers of parties due to the coordination required to actually achieve a scaling benefit. Thus, covenant proposals such as OP-Evict or CTV via TX-out trees aim to allow more fine-grained outcomes where individual parties can be forced on-chain without forcing everyone on-chain at once. L2/LN symmetry. Since L2 is a terribly confusing name, we'll only use the updated name, LN symmetry, going forward. While Poon-Drya channels encourage the correct state to be published on-chain by punishing incorrect states, LN symmetry instead allows incorrect states to be updated with an additional transaction. This has the advantage of simplifying Lightning channels by removing the complexity of penalties. However, this is likely to be a disadvantage in untrusted scenarios, as penalties are arguably needed to discourage fraud. LN symmetry needs a soft fork to enable SIG-hash any prove-out, which is required to allow state transactions to respend other state transactions during updates. By itself, LN symmetry offers no scaling improvements on conventional Lightning channels, but proponents have argued that it makes things like channel factories much easier to implement. ARC. ARC takes a new approach to transaction scaling, fully transferable virtual UTXOs, VUTXOs, that can be merged and split in atomic off-chain transactions. In ARC, a central coordinator, the ARC service provider, ASP, provides virtual UTXOs for users with a defined lifetime, like 4 weeks. These periods are known as rounds. These virtual UTXOs are created via pool TX-outs, one per round, via some kind of mechanism such as CTV, to allow a single on-chain TX-out to commit to a tree of virtual UTXOs. This round expiration is how ARC achieves a scaling advantage, At the end of a round, the pool TX out unlocks, allowing the ASP to unilaterally spend with a single signature in a small transaction. Due to the round expiry time, the VUTXOs themselves expire when the pool TX outs creating them expire. Users who own a VUTXO must either spend that VUTXO prior to the pool TX out expiry time being reached, or put it on chain, unilateral withdrawal. To transact VUTXOs between parties, the ARC coordinator cosigns transactions that spend one or more VUTXOs, such that the transactions are only valid if one or more other VUTXOs are created in a different round. In combination with some careful timeouts, see the ARC docs for the full details, this dependency is what makes spending VUTXOs trustless. The VUTXOs can't be claimed on-chain unless new VUTXOs are created in a different pool transaction. There's a few potential ways to actually implement that dependency, but the exact details aren't relevant to the purposes of this article. Notice how this means that a given ASP will have many different active rounds happening at once. New rounds are frequently created to allow funds in existing rounds to be transferred, but the existing rounds overlap to new rounds, as they will generally expire sometime after new rounds and new pool TX outs are created. ARC economics. When a virtual UTXO is spent, the ASP must provide matching Bitcoin and a new pool TX out representing a new round. But they can't recover the value of the spent VUTXO until the round expires. Thus, the economics of VUTXO spends has a time value of money cost. Due to the liquidity the ASP has to provide. Specifically, the cost is incurred when the VUTXO is spent. While the VUTXO is unspent, it represents a very real potential UTXO that could be put on chain to unilaterally withdraw the funds. The user owns those funds. However, to spend the VUTXO, the ASP must create a new pool TX out using funds the ASP obtains elsewhere, while the funds in the spent VUTXO are not available to the ASP until the expiry time is reached. Thus, spending the VUTXO requires a short-term loan, borrowing funds to cover the time interval between now and when the round expires. This means that the liquidity cost to spend a VUTXO actually declines as the VUTXO gets older and the expiry time gets closer, eventually, in theory, reaching zero when the round finally expires. Finally, remember that the cost to spend a VUTXO is related to the total size of the VUTXO spent, not the amount paid to the recipient. This means that while it's intended for transacting VUTXOs directly, as opposed to managing one VUTXO for the purposes of, for example, a VUTXO-based Lightning channel, have to make trade-offs in how they split up funds into VUTXOs. A single VUTXO minimizes the cost of unilateral withdrawal while maximizing liquidity-based transaction fees. Splitting up funds into many VUTXOs does the opposite. This is entirely unlike the economics of on-chain Bitcoin or Lightning transactions. What is this liquidity cost? As of writing, the Lightning wallet Phoenix charges 1% fee to reserve channel liquidity for 1 year. At worst, Phoenix would have to tie up their funds for 1 year. However, that assumes that the liquidity isn't used. It's quite possible that the cost of capital to Phoenix is in fact higher, and they are assuming that the average customer uses their incoming liquidity in less than 1 year. Phoenix also earns money off transaction fees, potentially subsidizing channel liquidity. Finally, Phoenix might not be profitable. The US Treasury bill rate gives us another estimate. As of writing, the 3-month Treasury bill rate is about 5% per year. Since there is an argument that this rate is inflated due to US dollars being inflationary, we'll assume the cost of liquidity for Bitcoin denominated funds is 3% per year for our analysis. If the round interval is 4 weeks, that means that a transaction would start off with a liquidity cost of 3% divided by 52 over 4 equals 0.23%, eventually declining to 0. Assuming the user tries to move their funds to a new round 2 weeks prior to the round expiring, the user is paying about 1.5% per year in liquidity costs to achieve self-custody of their funds. On the other hand, if the user waits until the last moment, the cost could be nearly 0, at the risk of missing the expiration time. Users may not see this as a trivial cost, and this cost assumes that fixed costs of each round have been made insignificant by amortizing transaction fees and other costs over large numbers of participants. What if fixed costs aren't so insignificant? Suppose that the ASP has 1,000 users and pool TX outs are created once an hour on average. Over a 4-week period, that's 672 on-chain transactions, which means to simply hold their funds, the ASP users collectively have to pay for almost as many transactions as users. It would probably be cheaper for them to all open their own Lightning channels, even though the ASP is requiring them to wait an entire hour for confirmation. Bootstrapping arc. A new ASP with few users faces a dilemma. Either ASP rounds happen infrequently, and users have to wait a long time for the proposed round to gather enough VUTXOs to achieve a useful scaling and transaction fee reduction, or ASP pool transactions happen frequently, with high transaction fees paid per user. As we showed in the previous section, it can take a lot of users to amortize frequent rounds and their underlying pool TX outs. Because rounds expire, this problem is an ongoing one, even worse than that faced by Lightning channels. At least the Lightning channel can continue to be useful indefinitely, allowing the channel to be opened now and amortized gradually over many months. Secondly, because rounds expire, there is less flexibility as to when to create the new TX outs backing these rounds. If fees are paid for a week or two, users whose pool TX outs are expiring have no choice but to, collectively, pay those high fees to maintain their custody over their funds. With Lightning channels, there is much more flexibility as to when to actually open a channel. While the authors of ARC initially imagined a very optimistic scenario where new rounds every few seconds, initial bootstrapping will probably have to happen with use cases that can afford to wait multiple hours for an ARC transaction to confirm if transaction fees are not subsidized. Interactivity. Non-custodial ARC is a highly interactive protocol. Since your VUTXOs expire, you have hard deadlines to interact with your ASP, or else the ASP could choose to take your funds. This interactivity can't be outsourced either. While Lightning has watchtowers that discourage counterparties from trying to rip you off, even if your channel hasn't been online, ARC coin owners must use their own private keys to refresh funds without trust. The closest thing possible in ARC to watchtowers would be to sign transactions allowing a watchtower to unilaterally withdraw your funds on-chain towards the expiration time. which has a significant transaction fee cost. Consider what happens to a VUTXO if the owner goes offline, or after the round expires, the ASP needs to recover the funds to get their liquidity back for further rounds. If a VUTXO owner goes offline, putting that VUTXO on-chain has significant transaction costs, as the ASP now needs to recover funds at multiple levels of the VUTXO tree. The ASP can recreate the unspent VUTXOs in a new round, but this isn't trustless from the perspective of the VUTXO owners, as they can't spend these VUTXOs without obtaining data from the ASP. The ASP could also simply record unspent VUTXOs as a custodial balance, or maybe even have a policy of seizing the funds. Personally, I suspect that given the non-trivial costs of self-custody in ARC, many users will instead choose ASPs with the policy of rolling over funds into a new round and simply accept the potential for fraud at the end of each round. This is cheaper than proactively moving their funds early enough to guarantee safety in the event that they fail to turn their phone on in time for the wallet to move the funds to a new round. Advanced ARC. It may be feasible to reduce the liquidity requirements of ARC through more advanced covenants. If it is typical for liquidity to be used up partway through a round, for example, let's suppose that 50% of the total VUTXO value in a pool TX out has been spent. If the ASP could redeem just that part of the round's pool TX out, they could recover liquidity quicker, reducing overall liquidity costs. While no concrete proposals on how to do this have been published, it certainly seems like it should be possible with sufficiently advanced TM covenants. Most likely, though, some kind of script revival software that adds many useful opcodes at once. Similarly, through sufficiently advanced TM covenants, the entire TX out tree structure could be replaced with some kind of rolling withdrawal scheme, potentially offering space savings. We'll cover this in a further section, as this technique is potentially useful for other schemes. The end-of-round custody issue is another case where sufficiently advanced TM covenants could solve a problem. A covenant, in particular a ZK proof covenant, could force the ASP to recreate all unspent VUTXOs in the next round, removing the problem of custody, reverting to them at the end of the round. While it is probably not possible to make this trustless, as the user will likely need some data from the ASP to spend their VUTXO in the new round, it could prevent the ASP from financially gaining from fraud against offline users. On-chain fee payment and unilateral withdrawal. Similar to Lightning, the economics of on-chain fee payment and the actual value of a VUTXO after fees determine whether ARC usage meets our definition of an L2 via unilateral withdrawal or fraud failing to benefit the ASP. We'll discuss the specifics of this further when we discuss the TX out tree design pattern. Validity rollups. A large class of sidechain-like constructs generally propose to use various forms of zero-knowledge ZK proof technology to enforce the rules of the chain. The ZK proof technology is the critical difference between validity rollup technology and other forms of sidechain. If the ZK proof scheme works, the validity of the transactions can be guaranteed by math rather than trusting a trusted third party. The zero-knowledge aspect of a ZK proof is not actually a requirement in this use case. It's perfectly okay if the proof leaks information about what it is proving. It just happens to be that most of the mathematical schemes for this class of proof happen to be zero-knowledge proofs. From the point of view of Bitcoin, a validity rollup scheme requires a covenant. And you want to be able to create UTXOs for the scheme that can only be spent if the rules of the scheme are followed. This is not necessarily a decentralized process. Many validity rollup schemes are in fact entirely centralized. The rollup proof is proving that the centralized transaction sequencer followed the rules for a particular sequence of transactions. As for what covenant, zero-knowledge proof technology is still a very new field, with advancements still being frequently made. So it is highly unlikely that we will see any opcodes added to Bitcoin that directly validate any specific ZK proof schemes. Instead, it is generally accepted that specific schemes would instead use more general opcodes, in particular opcat, to validate ZK proofs via scripts. For example, Starkware is campaigning to have opcat added. Validity rollups is such a large potential topic with so many low substance, high hype projects that we won't discuss it further beyond pointing out what opcodes potentially make this design class viable. BitVM. Very roughly speaking, BitVM is a way to construct a lightning channel between two parties such that the rules of the lightning channel are enforced by a zero-knowledge proof. Since it doesn't actually need covenants to be implemented on Bitcoin today, and because it can't directly be used to create an L2 system that scales beyond the 1 UTXO per user limit, we won't discuss it further. Hierarchical channels. Hierarchical channels aims to make channel resizing fast and cheap. Hierarchical channels do for channel capacity what the LN does for Bitcoin. However, they still don't fundamentally exceed the 1 UTXO per user limit. They don't require any changes to the Bitcoin protocol anyway, so we're not going to discuss them further. Their proponents should simply implement them. They don't need our permission. CoinPool. CoinPool allows multiple users to share a single UTXO, transfer funds between different users, and unilaterally withdraw. The CoinPool paper proposal requires 3 new soft fork features: SigHash any privout, a SigHash group, allowing a signature to only apply to specific UTXOs, and an op Merkle sub to validate the removal of specific branches from a Merkle tree. The latter could also be accomplished with opcat. At the moment, CoinPool development seems to have stagnated, with the last commit to the specification website being 2 years ago. Enigma Network. While I was asked to cover the Enigma network, there seems to be a lack of documentation as to what the proposal really is. Bitfinex's blog post makes a lot of claims. The MIT page is empty. Since the blog post doesn't really make it clear what exactly is supposed to be going on, we won't discuss it further. Mempool considerations. Currently, mempool policy in Bitcoin Core is not ideal for L2 systems. Here, we'll go over some of the main challenges they faced and potential improvements. First, transaction pinning. Ultimately, an economic exploit, transaction pinning attacks refer to a variety of situations where someone can intentionally or unintentionally make it difficult to get a desired transaction mined due to the prior broadcast of a conflicting transaction that does not get mined. This is an economic exploit because in a true transaction pinning situation, there exists a desirable transaction that miners would profit from if they mined it. The conflicting pinning transaction is not mined in a reasonable amount of time, if ever. The simplest example of pinning comes from the fact without full RBF, transaction replacement can be turned off. Thus, we can have a low fee rate transaction with replacement turned off that will not be mined yet, can't be replaced. Essentially, 100% of hash power has fixed this issue by enabling full RBF, and as of writing, full RBF should be enabled by default in the next release of Bitcoin Core, after 11 years of effort. That leaves BIP 125 Rule 3 pinning. The only remaining pinning issue that is relevant to multi-party L2 protocols and unfixed in Bitcoin Core. For reference, BIP 125 Rule 3 states the following. A replacement transaction is required to pay the higher absolute fee, not just fee rate, than the sum of fees paid by all transactions being replaced. This rule can be exploited by broadcasting a large, low fee rate pinning transaction, spending the outputs relevant to the multi-party protocol. Alternatively, a group of transactions. Since the transaction has a low fee rate, it will not be mined in a timely fashion, if ever. Yet, since it has a high total fee, replacing it with a different transaction is uneconomical. Rule 3 pinning is fairly easily fixed via replace by fee rate, and this fix works in all situations. Unfortunately, it's unclear if RBF-R will be adopted by Core in the near future, as they've spent a substantial amount of effort on an inferior partial solution, SHRUC/V3 transactions. Fee payment. RBF, child pays for parent, SIGHASH, anyone can pay, anchors, and sponsorship. Since fee rates are unpredictable, reliably and economically paying in situations where transactions are pre-signed is difficult. The gold standard for fee payment is to use RBF, starting with an initial lowball estimate, and replacing the transaction with higher fee versions as needed until it gets mined. For example, the Open Timestamps calendar software has used RBF this way for years, and LND added support for deadline-aware RBF in version 0.18. RBF is a gold standard for fee payment because it is the most block space efficient in almost all situations. The replacement transactions do not need any extra inputs or outputs relative to what would have been necessary if the correct fee had been guessed the first try. Efficiency is important because inefficiencies in fee payments make out-of-band fee payment a profitable source of revenue for large miners. Smaller decentralized miners can't profit from out-of-band fee payments due to the impracticality and uselessness of paying a small miner to get a transaction confirmed. Out-of-band fee payment also seems to invite AML KYC issues. At present, most of the out-of-band fee payment systems actually available right now require some kind of AML/KYC process to make a fee payment, with the notable exception of the mempool.space accelerator, which, as of writing, August 2024, accepts Lightning without an account. To make use of RBF directly in situations with pre-signed transactions, you need to pre-sign fee variants covering the full range of potential fees. While this is quite feasible in many cases, as the number of variants necessary is usually small, so far the production Lightning protocol and other proposed protocols have opted instead to use child pays for parent, usually via anchor outputs. The idea behind an anchor output is you add one or more outputs to a transaction with a minimal or zero value with the intent of paying fees via child pays for parent by spending those outputs in secondary transactions. This, of course, is very inefficient when applied to protocols such as LN that have small on-chain transactions, almost doubling the total size of an ephemeral anchor output using LN commitment transaction. It would be less of a concern when applied protocols making use of larger transactions, such as anything using opcat to implement covenants. A less obvious problem with anchor outputs is the need to keep around additional UTXOs to pay fees with. In a typical client application, this can be a significant overall burden, as without the anchor outputs, there is often no need at all to maintain more than one UTXO. Indeed, it is likely that some existing consumer-focused Lightning wallets are vulnerable to theft at the remote side of the channel in high-fee environments due to inability to pay fees. Cash anyone can pay can be used for fee payment, in some cases by allowing additional inputs to be added to signed transactions. Cash single allows outputs to also be added. Lightning uses this for HTLC transactions. At the moment, this practice can be vulnerable to transaction pinning if not handled carefully, as an attacker could add a large number of inputs and or outputs to a transaction to create a high fee / low fee rate pin. RBFR fixes this issue. The approach used in Truck v3 transactions is unable to fix this issue. This style of fee payment isn't as efficient as RBF, but it can be more efficient than anchor outputs. Finally, there have been a variety of software proposals to add a fee sponsorship system to the Bitcoin protocol. This would allow transactions to declare dependencies on other transactions, such that the sponsor transaction could only be mined if the sponsor transaction was also mined, most likely in the same block. This could be much more efficient than a traditional child pays for parent, as the sponsor transaction could declare that dependency using significantly less virtual bytes than the size of a transaction input. Replacement cycling. The replacement cycling attack takes advantage of transaction replacement to attempt to replace a desired L2 transaction long enough to get undesired one mine instead. Essentially, replacement cycling attacks are, for the attacker, an alternative to transaction pinning techniques, in that they aim to prevent a desired honest transaction from being mined long enough to allow an undesired dishonest transaction to be mined instead. Unlike transaction pinning attacks, a replacement cycling attack can't happen by accident. The canonical example is against a hash time lock contract, HTLC. While it's easy to think of an HTLC as being a contract to either allow a transaction to be spent via the revealing of a preimage or via a timeout, in reality, due to Bitcoin scripting limitations, an HTLC allows a transaction to always be spent via revealing a preimage, and then after a timeout, additionally via the timeout mechanism. Replacement cycling takes advantage of this, using the preimage after the timeout to replace the transaction trying to redeem the HGLC output via the timeout mechanism, without the victim learning the pre-image. A successful replacement cycling attack does this long enough for a different channel's HGLC to time out. A main challenge in profitably exploiting a replacement cycling is that each replacement round costs money. A deadline-aware Lightning implementation will spend higher and higher fees attempting to spend the expired HGLC output before the expiry of the next HGLC output, in turn, expires. Secondly, anyone can defeat the attacks by simply rebroadcasting the replaced transaction once the replacement cycle is finished. As with transaction pinning, replacement cycling is also an economic exploit on miners. At the end of each replacement cycle, there exists a transaction that has been removed from mempools, yet is fully valid and could be mined if only miners still had it in their mempools. Feature patterns in soft forks. Now that we've given you an overview of the variety of covenant-dependent L2 systems out there and mempool challenges, we're going to try to distill that information down to a set of notable soft fork features, mainly new opcodes, and design patterns that these L2 systems share. For soft fork proposals, we'll also discuss the proposal-specific technical risks and challenges of getting each proposal deployed. Op-expire. We'll get this out of the way first. Op-expire was proposed as a simple way of eliminating the replacement cycling attack by fixing the problem at the source. The fact that HGLCs can be spent in two different ways at once. In the context of L2 systems, this is relevant for anything using an HGLC-like mechanism, and possibly other use cases. Op-expire would make it possible for a transaction output to be unspendable after a point in time, allowing the HGLC spending conditions to be a true exclusive OR rather than a programmer's OR. An actual op-expire soft fork would most likely consist of two features, similar to how the op-check block time verify and op-check sequence verify opcodes come in two parts. An expiration height field for transactions, most likely implemented in the taproot annex. An op-expire opcode that checks that the expiration height is set to at least the desired height. While op-expire itself barely qualifies as a covenant, it does appear to be useful for many covenant-dependent L2 systems. However, it may not be useful enough, given that replacement cycling can also be mitigated by altruistic rebroadcasting. A very notable challenge with deploying and using op-expire is reorgs. The Bitcoin technical community, starting with Satoshi, has tried to ensure that Bitcoin Consensus Protocol is designed in such a way that after a deep reorg, previously mined transactions can be mined into new blocks. This design principle attempts to avoid the nightmare scenario of a large number of confirmed coins becoming permanently invalid, and thus people relying on those coins losing money. If a consensus failure leads to a large reorg. In the event of a large reorg, transactions using expiration could become unminable due to their expiry height being reached. The op-expire proposal proposes to mitigate this issue by treating the outputs of expiration using transactions similarly to Coinbase transactions, also making them unspendable for roughly 100 blocks. A significant barrier to deploying transaction expiration is coming to consensus on whether or not this trade-off is acceptable, or even needed. The types of transactions where op-expire would be useful already involve longish timeouts, where user funds are frozen. Adding even more time to these timeouts isn't desirable. Also, double spends have always been another way to invalidate coins after a reorg. With the increased use of RBF and proposed use of keyless anchor outputs, would transaction expiration make a significant difference? Sighash and ePrivout proposes two new signature hashing modes, both of which do not commit to the specific UTXO being spent. Sighash and ePrivout, which essentially commits to the script pub key instead, and Sighash and ePrivout script, which allows any script as discussed above. This was originally proposed for use by LN Symmetry to avoid the need to separately sign every single prior channel state that may need to be reacted to. Sighash and ePrivout is also potentially useful in cases where we want to use pre-signed RBF fee rate variants in conjunction with pre-signed transactions, as the fact that the signature no longer depends on a specific TXID avoids a combinatorial explosion of fee rate variants. However, the current BIP 118 proposal doesn't address this use case and may be incompatible with it due to the fact that Sighash and ePrivout is proposed to also commit to the value of the UTXO. An initial objection to Sighash and ePrivout was the idea that wallets would get themselves into trouble by using it in inappropriate ways. The issue is that once a single Sighash and ePrivout signature has been published, it can be used to spend any TX out with a specific script. Thus, if a second output with the same script is accidentally created, Sighash and ePrivout allows for a trivial replay attack to steal those coins. However, if there are so many other footguns inherent to wallets and L2 implementations, this concern seems to have died out. At the moment, the general technical community seems reasonably positive about implementing BIP 118. However, as discussed above in our discussion of LN Symmetry, there is debate about whether its main use case, LN Symmetry, is actually a good idea. Op check template verify. Our first covenant-specific opcode proposal. Op check template verify, or CTV, as it's commonly referred to, aims to create a specific restricted covenant opcode by doing exactly one thing: hashing the spending transaction in a specified way that does not commit to the input UTXOs, and checking the resulting digest against the top stack element. This allows the spending transaction to be constrained in advance without making true recursive covenant restrictions possible. Why aren't recursive covenants possible in CTV? Because hash functions. The CTV checks the spending transaction against the template hash, and there's no way of creating a template containing a CTV with a hash of itself. That said, this isn't necessarily a real limitation. You can easily hash a chain of CTV template hashes to a depth of tens of millions of transactions in just a few seconds on a modern computer, with relative end sequence time logs. And the limited block size actually reaching the end of such a chain would easily be made to take thousands of years. The current CTV proposal in BIP 119 has only one hashing mode, known as the default check template verify hash, which essentially commits to every aspect of the spending transaction and the template hash. From a practical point of view, this means that in many circumstances, the only available mechanism for fee payment will be child pays for parent. As mentioned above, this is a potential problem due to it making out-of-band fee payment a non-trivial cost savings in cases where the CTV using transactions are small. It's fair to say that CTV has the broadest support among the technical community of any Covenant opcode proposal because of its relative simplicity and wide range of use cases. L-enhance. One proposal to implement CTV is to combine it with two more opcodes, opcheck sig from stack, verify, and of op internal key. The problem is, as of writing, the documentation of that pull request and associated bibs simply isn't sufficient to argue for or against this proposal. The bibs are entirely lacking any rationale for what the opcodes are expected to actually do in real-world examples, let alone in-depth example scripts. While the authors probably have good reason for their proposal, the onus is on them to actually explain those reasons and justify them properly. Thus, we won't discuss it any further. Op-tx hash. Similar to CTV, this proposal achieves a non-recursive covenant functionality by hashing data from the spending transaction. Unlike CTV, the TX hash proposal provides a field selector mechanism, allowing flexibility in exactly how the spending transaction is constrained. This flexibility achieves two main goals. One, enabling the addition of fees to a transaction without breaking a multi-transaction protocol. And two, multi-user protocols where users only constrain their own inputs and outputs. The problem with op-tx hash is that the field selector mechanism adds quite a lot of complexity, making review and testing challenging compared to the much simpler CTV proposal. At the moment, there simply hasn't been much design analysis on how beneficial the field selector mechanism would actually be, or how exactly it would be used. Thus, we won't discuss it further. Opcat. The concatenation operator that concatenates the top two elements of the stack and pushes the concatenated result back onto the stack. Bitcoin originally shipped with opcat enabled, but Satoshi quietly removed it in 2010, probably due to the fact that the initial implementation was vulnerable to denial of service attacks due to the lack of restrictions on the size of the resulting script element. Consider the following script. Dupe cat dupe cat. Dupe cat dupe cat dupe cat dupe cat. Without an element size restriction, each dupe cat iteration doubles the size of the top stack element, eventually using up all available memory. Concatenation is sufficient to implement many types of covenants, including recursive covenants, by doing the following. 1. Assemble a partial transaction without witness data on the stack with one or more invocations of opcat and whatever covenant-specific logic is needed. 2. Validate that the transaction on the stack matches the spending transaction. As it turns out, by abusing the math of Schnorr signatures, it's possible to perform the second step with opcheck sig via carefully constructed signatures. However, it's more likely that an opcat soft fork would be combined with opcheck sig from stack, allowing the second step to be performed by validating that a signature on the stack is a valid signature for the transaction, and then reusing that same signature with opcheck sig to validate that the spending transaction matches. The fact that we only need to assemble the transaction without witness data is a key point. The covenant only needs to validate what the transaction does, its inputs and outputs, not witness data, if any, that actually makes it valid. Modulo script size limits, the combination of opcat and opcheck sig from stack, is sufficient to build many types of covenants, including recursive covenants. Compared to more efficient solutions like CTV, it is more expensive, but the difference in cost is less than you would expect. Roughly speaking, using OpCat to do this requires all of the non-witness part of the spending transaction to be placed on the stack via the witness. For typical CTV use cases such as TX-out trees, the spending transaction will have no witness data at all. Since witness space is discounted 75%, that increases our effective transaction fee for the child transaction by only 25%. Not bad! Is OpCat too powerful? This is probably the biggest political and technical obstacle to deploying OpCat. It's very hard to predict what use cases will be made possible by OpCat, and once the cat is out of the bag, it's very hard to put back in. A great example is how OpCat is claimed to be sufficient to allow reasonably efficient and secure Stark verification to implement in Bitcoin script. Since Starks are capable of proving extremely general statements, making it possible to implement Starks efficiently has significant ramifications that go beyond the scope of L2 systems, as it would allow many different systems to be built on top of Bitcoin. A strong argument against OpCat is that these use cases may not be a whole good. A strong argument against OpCat is that these use cases may not be, on a whole, good for Bitcoin users. The creation of harmful centralizing minor extractable value is a key potential problem, termed MEV is evil, or MEVIL, by Matt Corallo. In short, MEVIL is any circumstance where large miners or pools can extract additional value by employing sophisticated transaction mining strategies, beyond simply maximizing total fees, that are impractical for smaller miners or pools to adopt. The sheer complexity of potential financial instruments that could be created with OpCat makes ruling out MEVIL difficult. Significant MEVIL has already appeared on Bitcoin from token auction protocols. Fortunately, that specific case was defeated via the adoption of full RBF. In addition to the potential of MEVIL, there are many other concrete OpCat use cases that are potentially harmful. For example, the drive chain's proposal has been reviewed here and is widely considered to be harmful to Bitcoin. It is believed to be possible to implement drive chains with OpCat. Another example is token proposals such as Taproot assets. While it is impossible in general to prevent them from being implemented with client-side validation, there are proposals to implement them with OpCat in ways that are potentially much more attractive to end users, while also using much more block space, which could potentially outbid legitimate Bitcoin transactions. These use cases may also raise legal issues due to how often token protocols are used for financial fraud. Incremental hashing. For covenants, OpCat would be primarily used to concatenate data and then hash it. Another way to achieve the same goal is with some kind of incremental hashing opcode that takes a SHA-256 mid-state of some kind and hashes more data into it. SHA-256 itself operates on 64-byte blocks. There are many possible designs for incremental hashing opcodes. One important design decision is whether or not to expose the actual mid-state bytes on the stack in some kind of canonical form, or represent them in some kind of some new kind of opaque stack item type whose actual byte value can't be directly manipulated. SHA-256 is specified for a particular fixed initialization vector, and it appears to be unknown whether or not SHA-256's cryptographic properties hold true if arbitrary mid-state/initialization vectors are allowed. Of course, since incremental hashing can be pretty much what OpCat can do, just more efficiently, it shares all the concerns about OpCat being too powerful. Script revival. OpCat was one of 15 opcodes that Satoshi disabled. In addition to restoring OpCat, Rusty Russell is proposing to essentially restore Bitcoin script to Satoshi's original vision, quote unquote, by re-enabling most of those opcodes, adding denial of service limits, and potentially adding a few more in the same soft fork. In particular, an op-check sig from stack is likely. While OpCat alone does make recursive covenants possible, a full script revival would make more sophisticated covenants possible, and much easier to implement, as parts of the spending transaction could be manipulated directly. For example, you could imagine a covenant script that uses arithmetic opcodes to ensure that the total value of the TX house in the transactions adheres to some desired property. Again, script revival raises all the same concerns and more about being overly powerful that OpCat alone does. Simplicity. Similar to script revival, simplicity is relevant to L2s and covenants by making it possible to do anything. Unlike script revival, a simplicity soft fork would add an entirely new programming language to Bitcoin's scripting system based on 9 primitive operators known as combinators. In practice, simplicity is both too simple and not simple at all. The primitive combinators are so ridiculously low level that basic operations like addition have to be laboriously implemented from scratch. Raw simplicity would be exceptionally verbose in practice. Thus, any real usage of simplicity would make use of a system of code substitutions, similar to library function calls, known as jets. This poses a practical/political problem. How do you decide on which jets to implement? Most likely, jets would be implemented in C++ like any other opcode, requiring a soft fork for each new jet. Fancy tree manipulation stuff. There's a large variety of relatively specialized opcodes that have been proposed to do tree manipulation in a space-efficient manner for covenant-dependent L2 proposals. For example, the coin pools have proposed both tap-leaf update verify and op-merkle sub, both of which manipulate taproot trees in ways necessary for the coin pools protocol, and the map proposal has proposed a op-check contract verify opcode that basically verifies statements about Merkle trees. For the purposes of this article, we don't need to go into detail about each one of these many proposals. Rather, we can talk about them as a group. They're all relatively use case specific proposals that make one class of L2 possible, ideally without unintended side effects. They all have the advantage of efficiency. They all use less block space than achieving the same goal with more generic opcodes, such as OpCat manipulation. But they all have the disadvantage of adding complexity to the script system for a potentially niche use case. The same dynamic would happen if Bitcoin adopted the simplicity scripting system. The equivalent to opcodes in simplicity is adding a jet for a commonly used pattern, Again, implementing jets for use case specific operations like tree manipulation has similar pros and cons as implementing complex opcodes for use case specific operations. Fund pools. All L2 systems that try to have multiple users share a single UTXO can be thought of as some kind of multi-user fund pool, with users being in possession of some kind of right of withdrawal. Potentially, there will also be a mechanism to add funds to the pool, beyond creating the pool with funds pre-assigned. For a fund pool to be useful, it must have some kind of share data state associated with it. However, is the TX-out value split up? If the fund pool is to evolve over time, that state must also change as funds are added or removed from the pool. Since we're building on Bitcoin, adding or removing funds from the pool will inevitably involve spending the UTXO the pool controls. Remember that the Bitcoin consensus system itself is based on validation of state changes. Transactions prove via their witnesses that changes to the UTXO set state are valid proof of work lets us come to consensus over which set of transactions is correct. This means that fund pools are themselves also going to be based on validation of state changes. We're proving to every Bitcoin node that the rules for the fund pool are being followed on every state change. But there's another key aspect to trustless L2 fund pools. When the state of the fund pool changes, the system must inherently publish sufficient data for users participating in the fund pool to recover their funds. If we haven't done that, then our system fails to provide unilateral withdrawal without the cooperation of third parties. Many rollup based schemes fail here. They suffer from data availability failures, where the user is unable to recover their funds if third-party coordinators go offline, because they have no way of getting the data necessary for them to construct a valid fund recovery transaction. With these constraints in mind, what data structures are fund pools going to be based on? Inevitably, they're all some kind of tree, specifically some kind of Merkle tree. They have to be a tree, because that's pretty much the only scalable data structure in computer science. They have to be Merkleized, because that's basically the only reasonable way to cryptographically commit to the state of the tree. Finally, updates to the tree are inevitably going to be published to the Bitcoin blockchain, because that's the one publication medium all L2 users share, and the only one that we can force users to publish on to move coins, and because any covenant implementation is going to need parts of the tree to validate that the rules of the covenant are being followed. So, with the high-level theory out of the way, how does this actually translate into Bitcoin scripts and transactions? Individual pre-signed transactions. The degenerate case of a tree with exactly one leaf in it. Here the state of our fund pool can change state, roughly speaking, once. For example, a standard lightning channel falls into this category, and once opened, can only be closed. The data that is published when a channel is closed is the transaction itself, which is sufficient information for the counterparty in the channel to learn the TXID from blockchain data and recover their funds by spending them. The only covenant required here is the most basic covenant, the pre-signed transaction. TX-out trees. The next, more complex design pattern we see in fund pool is the TX-out tree. ARC is a notable example. Here the fund pool can be split up by spending the root UTXO in a tree of predefined transactions, enforced with simple covenants like pre-signed transactions or CTV, splitting up the value of that UTXO into smaller and smaller amounts until leaf nodes are reached that are spendable by the rightful owners. It's important to recognize that the purpose of the TX-out tree is to give users options as to how to recover their funds, and those options come at a cost. A TX-out tree will always be a more expensive way to split up a pool of funds, returning them to their owners, than simply splitting up the UTXO into a single transaction. Each layer in the tree adds cost because of the bytes used in the TX-outs and TX-ins necessary to create that layer. So what kind of options might a TX-out tree provide? Again, ARC is a great example. We don't want the on-chain redemption of a single virtual UTXO to require every single virtual UTXO to be put on-chain. By using a tree redemption, can instead split up the tree into smaller parts until the desired virtual UTXO is put on-chain. Similar to the individual pre-signed transaction case, the information being published is the transactions themselves, which informs other users' wallets how to spend their funds if necessary. The scalability of TX-out trees has interesting economies of scale. The cost for the first virtual UTXO to be put on-chain in a fund pool with n virtual UTXOs is roughly log 2 n times more expensive than a single transaction, as log 2n levels of split transactions must be put on-chain. However, once the first virtual UTXO is put on-chain, subsequent virtual UTXOs become cheaper to redeem on-chain because someone else has already paid the cost of getting the intermediary transactions mined. Recall that the total number of elements in a binary tree with n leaves is 2n. This means that to put all virtual UTXOs on chain, the total cost to do so via a TX-out tree would be a small multiple of the total cost to do so in a single transaction. Surprisingly efficient. Or maybe not. If the total size of the fund pool redemption are significantly high, they may represent a non-trivial demand on total overall block space. Block space is a supply and demand system. So at some point, fees will go up due to high demand. At the extreme, it's quite possible to create TX-out trees so big and so deep that actually redeeming every virtual UTXO in the tree is impossible. An open question with TX-out trees is who pays the fees and how. One obvious solution is to use keyless anchor outputs on the leaf transactions and allow whomever wants the leaf transactions to get mined to pay the fees via child pays for parent. In some use cases, the virtual UTXOs themselves can be spent immediately after creation without a CSV delay. So the virtual UTXOs themselves could be spent to add fees via child pays for parent. RBF is complex to implement due to permission. The obvious place to take fees for RBF from is the VUTXO value. But how do you ensure that only the owner has the ability to sign for a higher fee transaction? In many circumstances, it's not obvious how to do this in a way that is more efficient than a keyless anchor output. However, failing to do that does pose serious challenges for schemes used by end-user wallets that may not have a UTXO to spend to perform a child pays for parent, if the VUTXOs themselves can't be spent immediately. Finally, careful thought needs to be put into what incentives there are in TX-out tree systems, taking fee payment into account. For example, in an ARC-like system, if a set of virtual UTXOs individually costs too much money to be worth taking to on-chain, VUTXOs An uncooperative coordinator could refuse to allow these VUTXOs to be redeemed off-chain, and then make a profit by stealing the value of those VUTXOs in a single UTXO spend once a timeout is reached. If this is the case, arguably such a system would fail our criteria to be an L2 for small virtual UTXOs. Balance-based schemes. The state machine of a TX-out tree is still relatively simple. Either the fund pool exists, or it is spent to create two or more smaller fund pools. With more advanced covenants, we could instead treat the fund pool as an evolving balance, with the ability to add and subtract funds from that balance. To do this, we need to implement a non-trivial state machine, but we also need what is essentially a shared database. Why? Because the goal here is to share one UTXO across many different owners. Finally, if we're actually going to get a scalability improvement, we must do so in a way that puts as little as possible of that ownership data on-chain. These requirements inherently lead us to some kind of tree-like Merkleized data structure, such as a Merkle sum tree. Manipulating that data structure is inherently going to require something like opcat, some kind of zero knowledge proof verification opcode, or a purpose-specific tree manipulation opcode. Interestingly, as in TX-out trees, you can't do better than order log n, scaling while maintaining similar security properties. Why? Let's suppose we had a hypothetical op ZKP, which through some advanced mathematics needed a mere 32 bytes to prove any statements. While this ZK proof could prove that the Merkleized data structure had been manipulated according to the rules of the layer 2 system, it would fail to provide the data necessary for the next user to also make a state change. This fails our preferred criteria of enabling unconditional withdrawal. At best, one user might be able to achieve an unconditional withdrawal, but no further users could do so. By contrast, if the modified parts of the Merkleized data structure are published via the covenant script sig, like the sibling digests in a Merkle tree, the next user has enough data to update their understanding of the system state and themselves make an unconditional withdrawal. A potential way around this problem is if the covenant requires proof of publication on a different publication medium than the Bitcoin chain. However, the security guarantees will be weaker than is possible via Bitcoin. Finally, notice how TX-out trees and a balance-based approach can be combined. If the data structure being manipulated is a TX-out tree, funds could be added to the TX-out tree by spending in the output and adding new funds, with a covenant script that validates that the funds were in fact added to the TX-out tree. Equally, funds can be removed by all the mechanisms normally available to a TX-out tree. Advanced ARC is an example of this class of scheme. Failure data ratio. L2s achieve scaling by adding an interactivity requirement in adversarial situations. In nearly all cases, this means that honest parties in the protocol have deadlines by which they need to get their transactions mined. If the deadlines are not met, funds can be stolen. The maximum block capacity in all decentralized and centralized blockchains is limited by technical constraints. In Bitcoin, the maximum block size is such that Bitcoin operates essentially at capacity 100% of the time. Since Bitcoin mining acts as an auction system, auctioning off block space to the highest bidder, in practice, this means that the minimum fee rate to get a transaction mined goes up and down as demand increases and decreases. Fee rate always factors into L2 economics and failure modes. For example, in Lightning, dust-sized HTLCs are too small to be profitably redeemed on-chain. Use a different security model than larger HTLCs. While the Lightning protocol doesn't properly implement this yet, in theory, this threshold should be dynamic, based on fee rates as they go up and down. Ideally to the point where a party could choose whether or not an HTLC even exists in a given commitment transaction based on fee rate. A variety of attacks have been proposed where the situation is intentionally triggered on Lightning, such as flood and loot, and the mass exit attack. Since Bitcoin blockchain capacity is shared across all use cases, attacks between different L2 systems are also possible, like triggering a mass exit on Arc to profit from Lightning channels. L2s that share UTXOs among multiple users inherently make these problems potentially worse, as the worst case block space demand during a failure is proportionally higher. As of writing, we've never actually seen large-scale failures on Lightning where large numbers of channels had to be closed at once. There is a good argument that we should get additional operational experience with Lightning, and its approximately 1 UTXO per user scaling before pushing the limits even further with UTXO sharing schemes. Secondly, before new UTXO sharing schemes are widely adopted, careful research should be done on the potential profitability of attacks during high demand for block space. For example, in a system like Arc, where the ASP can redeem funds using much less block space than other parties, it may be the case that intentionally triggering high fee rates and then seizing funds that can't be profitably unilaterally withdrawn is a profitable fraud, violating both our conditions for a true L2 system. Consensus cleanup. There's a number of things that Satoshi got wrong in the initial Bitcoin protocol, in particular, scripting denial of service attacks, the time warp attack, and issues with the Merkle tree. Previously, a number of other consensus bugs have already been fixed with soft forks, such as the switch to evaluating time-based and lock times against the median time passed, attempting to fix the duplicate TXID issue, etc. The most recent soft fork, Taproot, had a relatively contentious deployment process, taking quite a long time to actually get deployed. An argument for doing a consensus cleanup soft fork first, prior to enabling any new opcodes or other features for new types of L2s, is that we'd learn more about how willing the wider community is to implement what should be a relatively uncontroversial soft fork that arguably benefits everyone. Testing soft fork dependent L2s. Developers do not need to wait for a soft fork to actually happen to test out their ideas. One particularly sophisticated approach being used by the Arc developers in covenant-less Arc is to simulate the covenants they need with pre-signed transactions. This allows them to test out ideas of Arc with real Bitcoin on mainnet, with the same trust characteristics, as Arc is expected to achieve with covenants. The trade-off is that covenantless Arc requires all parties to be online to sign the pre-signed transactions. Since CLArc, or covenantless Arc, does work with real Bitcoin, it may prove to even be useful enough to use in production for certain use cases, transfer that can tolerate the interactivity trade-off. A simpler approach is to simply pretend that certain parties can't do the actions that covenants would prevent. For example, if a proposal protocol wants to use CTV to enforce what a TX out tree is spent in a transaction tree, each use of CTV could be replaced with a NOP or check sig. While in reality, the TX out tree isn't actually being enforced, every bit of code interacting with the tree in each party can be tested as though it is. And since NOP and check sig are allowed in standard scripts, the protocol can be tested on mainnet with real funds. Potential soft forks. What's the path forward? Here, we're going to chart out all the main L2 schemes we've analyzed, and what soft forks are useful, or required, R, to make these L2 schemes successful. As discussed above, opcat, and by extension, script revival, which includes opcat, can emulate all of the other soft forks in this list, with the exception of op-expire and fee sponsorship. So where a project needs are most efficiently met by some other soft fork directly, we won't include opcat. We're also going to leave off the proposed Merkle tree manipulation opcodes. They're all too niche, too use case specific, and have a significant chance of getting too use case specific to have a significant chance of getting adopted at this time. To the extent that these opcodes are useful, implementing their effects via opcat and or script revival is much more likely path to adoption. So here, op-expire is useful for Lightning, Channel Factories, LN Symmetry, ARC, Advanced ARC, but not for validity rollups. Sig hash any priv out is useful for Lightning and required for LN Symmetry. That is all. CTV is useful for Lightning and Channel Factories and Advanced ARC and required for ARC. Opcat is only required for validity rollups, although we note, again, that opcat can emulate all of the other soft forks in this list. So where a project's needs are most efficiently met by some other soft fork directly, opcat was not included. Keep that in mind. Script revival, Advanced ARC, required, and useful for validity rollups. CTV is the clear winner here, followed by sig hash and improve out. Op-expire is useful to many things by being a replacement cycling fix, but not essential. CTV wins because so many things fit into the design pattern of make sure the spending transaction matches this template. Even opcat constructions can efficiently make use of CTV. Unlike opcat, CTV doesn't appear to raise much risk of unintended consequences, beyond encouraging out-of-band fee payments in certain cases. This isn't ideal, but no one has come up with a widely supported alternative. My personal recommendation: do a consensus cleanup soft fork, followed by CTV. These are the footnotes.